Help! Someone help my son! The desperate scream pierced through the peaceful afternoon at Riverside Park as 6-year-old Tommy Henderson's small head disappeared beneath the murky water of the lake for the third time. The Millionaire tech CEO Richard Henderson stood frozen on the wooden dock, his expensive Italian shoes keeping him from jumping into the dirty water below. Around him, dozens of well-dressed families at the exclusive park gathering watched in horror, their phones recording the nightmare unfolding before their eyes. But nobody moved toward the water. Nobody except the homeless black man they'd all been deliberately avoiding all afternoon, the one they'd whispered about and pointed at, the one whose presence had made them uncomfortable from the moment he'd quietly settled on a park bench near the shore. Jerome Washington didn't hesitate. At 52 years old, his weathered hands had known hardship, his calloused fingers had counted countless hungry nights, but his heart had never forgotten what it meant to save a life. The same hands that had once saved soldiers in Afghanistan, that had performed CPR on accident victims as an EMT, that had been forced to beg for spare change just to survive another day on the streets. Without a second thought, he dropped the worn backpack that contained everything he owned: a spare shirt, a water bottle, a tattered photo of his late wife, and the military dog tags he still wore around his neck despite everything life had taken from him, and sprinted toward the lake, his tattered sneakers pounding against the manicured grass that the wealthy families had been enjoying just moments before. As Jerome ran, memories flashed through his mind with startling clarity. The last time he'd been in water like this was 3 years ago, pulling a teenager from the Chattahoochee River after a car accident. He'd still been working as an EMT then, still had his apartment, still believed the system would take care of veterans like him who'd given everything for their country. That was before the PTSD episodes got worse, before the medical bills from his own service-related injuries piled up, before his employer decided that a medic with mental health issues was a liability they couldn't afford. The shock rippled through the crowd like electricity. Margaret Sinclair, wife of a prominent banker, gasped and pulled her own children closer. "What is he doing?" she whispered to her husband, her voice carrying the kind of judgment that had followed Jerome everywhere he went in this affluent neighborhood. She'd noticed him earlier, sitting alone on that bench, and had immediately called park security to complain about his presence near the children's play area. "He doesn't belong here," she'd told the security guard. "This is a private family of—" David Sinclair adjusted his Rolex and frowned, his mind already calculating the liability issues of having a homeless person at their exclusive park event. He'd been the one to suggest they should call the police, convinced that Jerome was either mentally unstable, potentially dangerous, or planning to steal from their cars while they were distracted by the family activities. The irony that this same man was now running toward his friend's Regin's son was completely lost on him in the moment. Patricia Williams, a pediatric surgeon whose own medical training should have compelled her to action, stood frozen beside her husband, her expensive handbag clutched tightly to her chest. Later, she would struggle to explain to herself why she hadn't moved, why her years of medical training had abandoned her when she was needed most. She watched Jerome's powerful stride and thought, for just a moment, about her own Hippocratic oath, and what it meant to first do no harm when doing nothing was the greatest harm of all. But Jerome heard none of their whispers, saw none of their disapproving stares. His eyes were locked on the exact spot where Tommy's small body had vanished beneath the surface, his military training from decades past suddenly flooding back with crystalline clarity. He'd learned to swim in the rivers of Georgia as a child, perfected his technique during his army service, and even though life had taken everything else from him, his career, his home, his dignity in the eyes of society, it hadn't taken his ability to move through water like he'd been born to it. As he reached the water's edge, Jerome made a split-second assessment that would have impressed his former commanding officers. Water temperature, cold enough to cause shock but not hypothermia in the short term. Visibility, poor due to murky conditions. Approximately 12 feet where the child had gone under. Current, minimal but present. Risk factors: his own advanced age, the fact that he hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days, and the reality that if something happened to him, no one would even know his real name to notify next of kin. None of that mattered. A child was drowning, and Jerome Washington had never walked away from someone who needed help, regardless of whether that help would be appreciated or acknowledged afterward. The water was shockingly cold as Jerome dove beneath the surface, but what he found in the murky depths would haunt him for the rest of his life. Tommy Henderson was sinking fast, his small arms no longer fighting, his eyes closed as the lake threatened to claim another victim. In that moment, suspended in the dark water with a child's life literally in his hands, Jerome flashed back to Afghanistan, to the moment when an IED explosion had torn through his medical unit's convoy. He'd been thrown clear, wounded but conscious, while 3 of his fellow medics lay trapped in the burning vehicle. That day, Jerome had made a choice that cost him everything but saved 3 lives. He'd gone back into the flames despite direct orders to wait for backup, despite the very real possibility that secondary explosions would kill them all. He'd pulled out Specialist Martinez first, then Corporal Davis, then finally Sergeant Kim, suffering severe burns and smoke inhalation that would plague him for the rest of his life. The Army had given him medals for his heroism, but the Veterans Affairs system had failed him when he needed help dealing with the physical and psychological aftermath. Now, years later and with nothing left to lose, Jerome found himself in another life-or-death moment where his actions would determine whether someone else's child came home that night. His powerful arms cut through the water with desperate precision, reaching Tommy just as the boy was about to disappear into the deeper, darker sections of the lake where recovery would have been impossible. As Jerome's strong hands wrapped around Tommy's limp body and powered toward the surface, Richard Henderson finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The reality of what he was witnessing struck him like a physical blow. The homeless man he'd complained about to park security just an hour earlier, the same man he'd wanted removed from their family-friendly gathering, was now fighting to save his son's life, while Richard himself had stood frozen with fear and prejudice. The crowd pressed closer as Jerome burst through the surface, Tommy's unconscious form cradled against his chest. Water streamed from both their bodies as Jerome swam toward the dock with powerful, determined strokes, his breath coming in sharp bursts but his grip on the child never wavering. Margaret Sinclair stopped recording with her phone, her hand covering her mouth as she realized she'd been documenting what might be either a miracle or a tragedy. "Move back, give him space." Jerome's voice commanded authority as he lifted Tommy onto the dock, immediately checking for breathing and pulse. His hands, scarred from years of surviving on the streets, moved with surprising medical precision as he positioned the child for. The crowd watched in stunned silence as this man they'd judged and dismissed demonstrated skills that none of them possessed. Jerome tilted Tommy's head back, cleared his airway, and began chest compressions with exactly the right rhythm and pressure. 1, 2, 3. His count was steady and professional, his focus absolute. Between compressions, he provided rescue breaths, his own life force literally flowing into the child's lungs as he refused to give up. "Come on, little man," Jerome whispered between compressions. "Come on back to us. Your daddy's waiting for you." But what happened next would change everything Richard Henderson thought he knew about judgment, about worth, and about the true meaning of heroism. After what felt like an eternity but was actually 90 seconds of perfect CPR technique, Tommy's small body convulsed, lake water poured from his mouth, and his eyes fluttered open with the most beautiful sound his father had ever heard, a gasping, choking breath that meant life. The crowd erupted. Phones that had been recording in shocked silence now captured cheers and tears as Tommy Henderson took his first conscious breath, coughed up more water, and looked around in confusion at the circle of faces staring down at him. His small hand reached out instinctively, not toward his millionaire father or any of the well-dressed adults surrounding him, but toward Jerome Washington, the homeless man whose quick action and skilled hands had pulled him back from the brink of death. "You're okay, son," Jerome said softly, his own voice shaking with relief as he gently helped Tommy sit up. "You're going to be just fine. You gave everyone quite a scare, but you're safe now." Richard Henderson dropped to his knees beside his son, his expensive suit soaking up the water on the dock as he pulled Tommy into a desperate embrace. Over his child's shoulder, his eyes met Jerome's, and for the first time in his privileged life, Richard Henderson was completely speechless. The man he'd wanted removed from the park, the man he'd judged based on appearance alone, had just saved the most precious thing in his world. "Thank you," Richard whispered, the words barely audible over his son's coughing. "Thank you so much." "I don't." Jerome stood slowly, water still dripping from his clothes, and picked up his worn backpack. "No thanks needed," he said quietly. "Just glad he's okay. Maybe get him checked by a doctor. Make sure there's no secondary drowning concerns." The medical knowledge in that simple statement hit Richard like another wave of realization. This wasn't just a homeless man who happened to be a strong swimmer. This was someone with training, with knowledge, with skills that had just saved his son's life. Someone he'd dismissed and prejudged based on nothing more than appearances and his own biases. As Jerome turned to leave, picking his way through the crowd of people who were now looking at him with completely different expressions, Richard felt something shift deep in his chest. The same man who built tech empires, who made million-dollar decisions without hesitation, who commanded boardrooms and dominated business negotiations, couldn't find the words to stop the hero who was quietly walking away. "Wait," Richard called out, his voice carrying across the park. "Please, wait." Jerome paused but didn't turn around immediately. He'd been in situations like this before, moments when his actions had helped others, followed by promises that were quickly forgotten once the crisis passed. Rich people, he'd learned, were generous with gratitude in the moment, but had short memories once their lives returned to normal. "I don't even know your name," Richard said, approaching slowly with Tommy still in his arms. "Jerome Washington," he replied, finally turning back. "And your boy's going to be fine, Mr. Henderson. Just keep an eye on him for the next few hours." Richard's eyes widened. Not only did Jerome know his name, but the way he'd said it suggested he knew exactly who Richard was. Tech billionaire, CEO of Henderson Digital, one of the wealthiest men in the state. Yet Jerome had acted without any knowledge of potential reward, without any expectation of recognition or compensation. "Mr. Washington," Richard began, his voice growing stronger as Tommy's breathing stabilized in his arms. "I owe you more than gratitude. You saved my son's life when I froze. When no one else acted, you didn't hesitate." Jerome nodded slightly. "Most people freeze in emergencies. It's human nature. What matters is Tommy's safe." But Richard was looking at Jerome with new eyes now, seeing details he'd missed before. The man's bearing was upright and confident despite his circumstances. His speech was educated and articulate. His knowledge of emergency medical procedures was clearly professional level. Most importantly, his character, the willingness to risk his own safety for a stranger's child, spoke to something far deeper than the surface appearance that Richard had so quickly judged. "Can I ask," Richard said carefully, "where you learned CPR like that? You knew exactly what to do." Jerome was quiet for a long moment, and Richard worried he'd overstepped. But then Jerome spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a story that few people had ever bothered to ask about. "Army medic," Jerome said simply. 2 tours in Afghanistan. After that, worked as an EMT for 15 years before." He trailed off, not finishing the sentence. Before what? Richard wanted to ask, but he sensed there was pain in that unfinished story. Pain that had led a trained medical professional and military veteran to be living on the streets, dismissed by people like Richard who saw only the surface and made assumptions about worth and character. The crowd was beginning to disperse, but many people lingered, their phones still recording this unexpected conversation between the billionaire and the homeless hero. Margaret Sinclair had stopped whispering criticisms and was now watching with something approaching shame on her face. David Sinclair had put away his phone and was explaining to his children why they should never judge people by their appearance. "Mr. Washington," Richard said, his decision crystallizing as he looked at the man who had saved his son. "I'd like to talk more if you're willing. I mean really talk. Would you let me buy you dinner? Somewhere we can sit down properly." Jerome's expression was unreadable. "That's not necessary, Mr. Henderson. Like I said, I'm just glad Tommy's okay." "It's not about necessity," Richard replied, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. "It's about getting to know the man who saved my son's life. It's about understanding how someone with your training and skills how you ended up in your current situation. And maybe, if you're open to it, it's about finding ways I can help change that situation." What happened next would become the most talked about story in the city. shared millions of times across social media and featured on news programs around the country. But for Richard Henderson and Jerome Washington, it wasn't about publicity or viral fame. It was about two men from completely different worlds discovering that heroism, dignity, and worth had nothing to do with bank accounts or zip codes. Jerome agreed to dinner, and over the course of a long conversation at a quiet restaurant, Richard learned the rest of Jerome's story. Medical discharge after an IED explosion that left him with PTSD, struggles with the VA system, job losses when employers discovered his mental health history, a gradual slide from middle-class stability to the streets, despite his education, training, and willingness to work. Richard also learned that Jerome had been living in Riverside Park for 3 months, not because he was dangerous or lazy, but because he was waiting for a spot in a veterans' transitional housing program. He'd been surviving on odd jobs and the kindness of a few local business owners who'd taken time to see past his circumstances to his character. By the end of that dinner, Richard had made several phone calls. The first was to the director of the Veterans Housing Program, expediting Jerome's placement with a substantial donation. The second was to his own company's HR director, discussing a position in Henderson Digital's corporate wellness program that would utilize Jerome's medical training and military experience. But the most important call was to his wife, telling her the full story of what had happened at the park and asking her to prepare their guest room. "We're going to have a house guest for a while," Richard explained. "The man who saved Tommy's life needs a place to stay while he gets back on his feet, and it's the least we can do." The transformation wasn't instant or without challenges. Jerome struggled with trusting that this opportunity was real, that Richard's gratitude wouldn't fade once the shock of the rescue wore off. Richard grappled with his own assumptions and biases, working to understand how society's safety nets had failed someone so capable and worthy of support. But 6 months later, Jerome Washington was thriving as Henderson Digital's Director of Emergency Response and Employee Wellness, a position created specifically for his unique combination of medical training, military experience, and personal understanding of how quickly life can change. His first initiative was a company-wide program to support veteran employees and their families, ensuring that no one who had served their country would face the struggles he had endured. Tommy Henderson, now 7 years and a strong swimmer thanks to lessons Jerome insisted on, had a new perspective on heroism that would shape his character for life. He'd learned that heroes don't always wear capes or live in mansions. Sometimes they carry everything they own in a backpack and sit quietly on park benches, waiting for their moment to save the world. The exclusive park gathering that had started with whispers and pointed fingers at an unwelcome homeless man ended with a community transformed. The families who had witnessed Jerome's heroism became advocates for veteran support programs and homeless assistance initiatives. Margaret and David Sinclair established a foundation providing emergency housing for veterans in crisis. Most importantly, Richard Henderson learned that wealth and success mean nothing if they don't come with the wisdom to recognize worth in others and the courage to act on that recognition. He'd almost lost his son because of his own prejudices, saved only by the quick action and moral character of a man he'd dismissed without thought. As Jerome often tells the groups he now speaks to about veteran homelessness and community support, heroism isn't about who you are or where you come from. It's about what you do when someone needs help and you're the only one willing to act. The video of Tommy's rescue and its aftermath garnered over 50 million views, but more importantly, it sparked conversations about homelessness, veteran support, and the dangerous assumptions we make about people based on their circumstances. It reminded everyone who watched that dignity, capability, and heroism can be found in the most unexpected places, often in the very people society overlooks or dismisses. Richard Henderson kept his promise to Jerome Washington, but their relationship evolved far beyond employer and employee, beyond gratitude and charity. They became friends, bound by a shared understanding that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in character, and that the most valuable investments we can make are in recognizing and nurturing the potential in others. And Tommy Henderson. He grew up knowing that the most important lesson his father ever taught him came not from words, but from watching how a single act of courage could change everything, and how the willingness to see past surface appearances could transform lives, communities, and hearts. Jerome Washington never forgot the feeling of pulling Tommy from that lake. But more importantly, he never forgot the feeling of being truly seen and valued for who he was, rather than what he appeared to be. In saving Tommy's life, he'd also saved his own, and in the process, he'd reminded an entire community that heroism is always possible, always necessary, and always waiting for those brave enough to dive in when others are afraid to act.